Welcome. Oh, that was so quiet so quickly. I'm impressed. It's an enormous pleasure to welcome you all here today for the 2025 AVERT International Research Symposium. My name is Professor Michelle Grossman. I'm the co-convener of the AVERT Research Network, along with Professor Julian Trugan, and I'm also the research chair in diversity and community resilience here at Deakin University's Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. Before we continue, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered over the next 3 days. We pay our respects to their elders and ancestors for allowing us to have our gathering on their land, acknowledge their continuing connection to this beautiful country, and thank them for their care and custodianship over many thousands of years. And I extend this respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. Education has a long and rich heritage on this continent, which we aim to honor and reflect in the ways that we teach, learn, and research. As I look out at the well over 150 people in the room here, including some people who were so enthusiastic that they booked their flights and accommodation but forgot to register, so a few surprises there. I'm reminded of the fact that AVERT held its first research symposium in 2018, which was the year that we started. Maybe 30 people, tops, academics, to explore some issues related to the ethics of terrorism research from both theoretical and practical standpoints. Since then, AVERT's development of deep and long-standing partnerships across many Australian and also international universities, as well as a variety of key government agencies, has enabled us to become a thriving research network of terrorism studies scholars and practitioners, and that intersection is really vital for us, who come from many different sectors, including academia, law enforcement, intelligence, policy, and community. At AVERT, we're very much committed to the national interest and the public good, but we're also very much internationally facing in our engagement, reach, and impact. We have over 100 credentialed research members from both Australia and a range of other countries, and the same number again of affiliate members from across the various sectors I mentioned a moment ago. As a network, we aim not only to highlight and showcase to the world the excellent and innovative research that we do here in Australia on terrorism and violent extremism, but also to bring the world's outstanding terrorism research and researchers into contact and dialogue with Australian practitioners and scholars. And this year's symposium beautifully exemplifies these aims. So for the first time, AVERT is privileged to offer our annual symposium as a collaborative effort between AVERT and two of the field's most stellar research and practice enterprises, VoxPol, the globally leading research network on online extremism and terrorism, and TASM, the Terrorism and Social Media Conference, both of which are based at Swansea University in the UK. And you'll be hearing a little bit more about both from Professor Stuart MacDonald in a moment. And of course, we are absolutely thrilled to have with us one of the world's leading authorities on extremism and the head of the American University's Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or Peril, Professor Cynthia Miller-Idris, who is, of course, our headline keynote speaker for the symposium this year. Now, the timing of this collaboration could not be more apt, given the challenges that we're now facing in the field of understanding and countering terrorism and violent extremism. There is nothing new anymore about the fact that we live in a digital world in which so-called online and offline spaces have become blended into what I like to call cross-line dimensions of everyday life. Nor is it news that terrorists and violent extremists, like anyone else who seeks to inform, direct, and shape the course of people's beliefs, feelings, and behaviors, have become expert at mobilizing digital means of communication and the power of influence that such affordances enable. And they do so in ways that, sadly, are often more agile and innovative than governments can achieve, bound as they are, at least in democratic societies, by various guardrails around human rights, privacy, and the social license conferred by the public. What is news, however, is the speed, depth, and penetration that digital life has been able to reach in a relatively short time. we're now confronted by significant generational divides in digital literacy. As an older generation of policymakers and researchers, guilty as charged, try to understand and manage the benefits, but also the risks and harms of online life, not only for themselves, but also for children and youth who outpace their elders in digital knowledge and expertise with nearly every swipe and keystroke. And as I wrote that line, I thought, they even use keystrokes anymore? Hope I'm not too behind the times. This generational literacy divide, coupled with the experience of new horizons of environmental, social, and economic precarity for many young people, and a corporate digital landscape that has proved adept at eluding meaningful regulation, even as it increases its ability to enhance profitable algorithms without much regard for their impacts, has created vulnerabilities and new vulnerabilities that allow extremists to exploit and channel needs, desires, fear, and anger for their own ideological and often violent purposes much more rapidly and also immersively than before. Alongside these developments, we're now in the midst of something like a paradigm shift in terms of how we understand and develop responses to terrorism, violent extremism, and also nonviolent forms of extremism that may nevertheless still be deeply harmful to both individual and collective social well-being. The field of terrorism studies, alongside policymakers and legislators in various countries, are asking pressing questions about whether our definition of terrorism, which is already characterized by a lack of consensus about what this actually means in different places and contexts and periods, is any longer fit for purpose, or whether it needs to be expanded, sharpened, or retooled. And of course, terrorism as a descriptor and a crime continues to be weaponized in new ways and forms from unexpected quarters, even as we acknowledge the long history of how that term has been weaponized in other periods and contexts. Similar questions are being asked about ideology, what it is, whether it's relevant anymore to how we counter violent extremism, and how we might understand the fluidity, mixing and matching, and general diversification of ideological platforms and narratives that have completely undone the old certainties around beliefs and ideas that we thought we knew and could navigate with some confidence. So this phenomenon of what I call recombinant extremism, which, like recombinant DNA, draws its strength and energy from combining material from a host of different sources to create new forms of extremist thought, feeling, and action, is definitely on the rise. And we'll learn more about its trajectories from various papers, roundtables, and workshops over the next 3 days. But also on the rise are deeper questions about artificial intelligence, its uses and capacities for both terrorist individuals and groups, and for counter-terror operations and frameworks, and whether and how we might be talking about human terrorism, AI terrorism, hybrid terrorism, or as yet unimagined forms of terrorism in times to come. All of these developments and questions challenge us to think about how we distinguish the signal from the noise in our contemporary world. What knowledge and tools might help us distinguish between signals that warn or guide us on what's around the corner and challenging us versus the noise that can deliberately or otherwise distract us from attending to the signals? And how do we manage to discern and respond to both noise and signals in the online, offline, and cross-line contexts that I've already touched on? So the papers, roundtables, and workshops that we're going to be hearing from over the next few days may not give us all the answers that we seek, but they will certainly help us think more clearly, freshly, and creatively about the challenges that we're grappling with and the kinds of responses that we might make. New knowledge and new practice are mutually informing, and my hope, as always, is that together we can explore and take with us new ideas and new ways of doing that will be showcased during this year's symposium for lasting benefit when we return to our various desks, screens, teams, and institutions. So just before I hand over to Julian to introduce our next speaker, a few words on housekeeping. So in case of emergency, please stay calm. Listen for the alarm tone should it go off, but the Deacon Downtown staff will come and guide us on how to exit and evacuate. But as always, don't ever go near any of the elevators in those circumstances. Toilets are located down the corridor to the left of the reception area as you stand with your back to reception, and staff at the reception desk will be very happy to direct you to the facilities if needed. We will definitely feed you over the next 3 days with morning tea, lunch, and afternoon tea provided each day, as well as a drinks and networking session with canapes at the close of the program on Tuesday, day 2 of the symposium, very kindly sponsored by GNet. At any time, you're welcome to help yourself to coffee and tea at either end of the plenary room. There are coffee and tea stations throughout the symposium. All the food during our breaks will be served at both ends of the plenary room. So don't feel that you all need to head to one door or the other when we have those breaks. During our parallel sessions, the plenary room, which we're in now, is just going to be divided into 2 so that these double sessions can take place. And our wonderful student volunteers up there in the back, can you all stand up for a moment? Look at this wonderful team. Thank you. Our wonderful student volunteers who have red dots on their name tags. If you need any assistance, will always be on hand to help guide both presenters and delegates to the room section where each of our sessions is being held. Now, everyone should have received a program in your folder at registration. If you didn't get a program, see the desk outside immediately to collect one. Inside your folder, on the inside cover is a QR code, okay? You use that QR code to access the full program, the abstracts, the bio notes for the presenters. So in line with Deacon's environmental policy about trying to minimize our use of paper, you've got the short program in your folders, but the big program with all the detail on it is through that QR code. If you have trouble with the QR code, please just approach one of the volunteers for help. Sessions are very tightly timed, and the chairs are going to be keeping very strictly to schedule, so we appreciate in advance you're moving swiftly from one session to the next to avoid any delays. If you decide to post on the socials during any of the talks, please do tag the AVERT Research Network. There is a QR code also included in the program, which will take you straight to the AVERT LinkedIn page, which is what we use. But please do check. Those people who are presenting or running roundtables and workshops, please let people know during your session if you don't want content shared on social media. Recording and photography, due to the sensitive nature of some of the presentations that we have today, please do not record or take any photos of presenters during the sessions themselves. But in between sessions, if you have colleagues and friends here and you want to take a photo, of course, feel free as long as they consent. Most, although not all, of our symposium sessions will be recorded and they'll be available later on the AVERT website. We also have with us for the first half of today our terrific Deacon photographer, Cormac, who's just standing there. Cormac is going to be taking some photos during sessions till about lunchtime today. But if anyone doesn't wish to be photographed, please approach Cormac directly to let him know. Some of the photos are then going to be used on the AVERT website, so please keep this in mind if you're considering whether or not you want to talk with Cormac about being photographed. As I said, our hardworking and lovely student volunteers are here to help you at any and all points during the symposium, and we're also very fortunate to have the support of the Deacon events team, the wonderful Jess, Louise, and colleagues who have done so much of the hard work behind the scenes for many months now in ensuring that we have a smooth event, along with our invaluable coordinator, Isel Ross, who many of you have been in touch with. Isel will be around, the volunteers are around, and the Deacon events team are seated outside and also happy to help. So the last couple of things, please put your phones on silent each and every day of the symposium. The Wi-Fi code for guests is displayed on the door at each end of the plenary room so that you can connect. Please remember to drop your name tags off at the end of each day at the table outside and collect them again in the morning, just to avoid you losing or misplacing them, because we don't really have the capacity to make new ones. And then when you leave us for the final time, whenever you depart, please remember to drop your name tag off so that we can recycle and reuse the holder. And with that, it is my pleasure now to hand over to my AVERT co-convener, Professor Julian Jurgen. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, for your opening remarks and for really, I think, setting the scene for us all this morning at the beginning of these 3 days. It's going to be a jam-packed and very exciting 3 days of papers, panels, roundtables, and also workshops. I'm Julian Drugan from Macquarie University, for those of you who don't know me, and it's a great pleasure to see all of you here. Some people I know, some people are new. We are very full this morning, as Michelle mentioned, but there are some chairs down the front here if anybody is still looking for somewhere to sit this morning. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our second speaker this morning, who's going to make some introductory remarks. This is, of course, Professor Stuart McDonald. As Michelle mentioned, we are co-branding and badging the symposium this year with the Voxpol Institute and also with TASM. Professor Stuart McDonald has the professorial chair of law at Swansea University in the UK, where he's also co-director of the Cyber Threats Research Centre. If that's not enough, Stuart is also the founder of the TASM, Terrorism and Social Media biannual research symposiums, and he's also the co-convener of the Voxpol network. Stuart, welcome, and looking forward to your remarks.
Good morning, and thank you to Julian for the introduction. On behalf of both Voxpol and TASM, I'd like to thank Avert for the opportunity to collaborate on this symposium. I was really delighted to receive the invitation, although I must admit that when Julian first invited me, I hadn't realised that the symposium would coincide with the first Ashes test. I'd like to use the next 10 minutes or so to tell you a bit about TASM and Voxpol. But first of all, I'd like to start with a quote, and this is taken from the 2011 version of the UK's counter-terrorism strategy contest. Extremist material on the internet will continue to motivate some people to engage in terrorism, but will rarely be a substitute for the social process of radicalisation. Now, this quote is interesting for a few reasons. First, because of the way it draws a distinction between consumption of extremist materials online, on the one hand, and processes of radicalisation on the other. Also implicit in the statement is that consumption of extremist online materials is not a social process. And this was largely the prevailing wisdom in 2011. That same year, Jason Burke wrote, "Twitter will never be a substitute for grassroots activism. In much of the Islamic world, social media is only for super-connected local elites or supporters in far-off countries. Neither are much use on the ground where it counts." Now, even if those claims were accurate in 2011, and I'm not sure that they were, but it's hard to imagine anyone making a similar claim today, less than 15 years later. And this illustrates the rapid evolution and pace of change in this field, which is why events like this symposium are so important, to understand the latest developments, to keep up to date, and to think through and discuss the implications for policy and practice. Events like this one can have an important agenda-setting influence. In preparing these comments, I revisited the keynote that was delivered by Professor Maura Conway in the opening plenary of the first TASM conference held back in 2017. She offered a number of suggestions for how the field of terrorism studies needed to develop. These included, first of all, widening the focus to include other ideologies, not just violent jihadism, and in particular, not just the so-called Islamic State. Second, also widening the focus in terms of platforms studied, in particular, widening the lens beyond just Twitter. Third, deepening inquiry, including by using a wider range of methodologies, including ethnography and interviews, developing a better understanding of online subcultures, and more analysis of visual content, not just a focus on text. And fourth, engaging with issues relating to gender, understood in a broader sense than just females. So to try and assess the response to Maura's suggestions made in 2017, I carried out some basic analysis of all the papers that have been presented at the past 4 TASM conferences. Across those 4 conferences, exactly 250 papers were presented, quite conveniently. And this first slide breaks them down by the ideological focus. It shows a marked shift away from studies of jihadism towards the far right, and more recently towards other ideologies, including inceldom and a variety of others that fall within the broader category of mixed, unclear, and unstable. If anything, I think this slide suggests a slight overcorrection, as scholarship on IS has decreased at the same time that the group has been resurgent in Africa. This next slide shows the breakdown by platform. In 2017, of those papers that did focus on a specific platform, the total number of different platforms that was examined was 5, predominantly Twitter, with the others being Facebook, YouTube, Stormfront, and Telegram. In the years since, there has been a diffusion with a greater number of platforms studied. There's been a growing emphasis on YouTube, which is illustrative of the growing engagement with visual content. And at the same time, there has been a growing concentration on Telegram, with roughly 1/3 of papers focusing on it in 2024. Now, while Telegram is undoubtedly a critical online space for groups of diverse ideologies, it is worth emphasizing, I think, the importance of not neglecting other platforms. So, for example, across the 4 years, none of the 250 papers examined Internet Archive. And in terms of Maura's suggestion that research should go deeper, this slide shows the breakdown by type of study. You can see that the proportion of papers that are empirical studies was markedly higher at the last 2 TASMs. I'll just run through the top 4 rows in the lower table. So content-based studies, these remain the most common type, and with the growth in visual analysis now cover a more diverse range of content than in 2017. Then you have studies of online behaviors, in which I've included ethnographic studies and studies of online subcultures. Studies of online visibility, in which I've included studies of propaganda dissemination strategies, evasion of content moderation and account takedown, and exploitation of platform affordances, such as recommendation algorithms. And studies of audience engagement, in which I've included radicalization pathways. So those are the top 4 where you see a significant proportion of papers. In contrast, you'll see that there has been a gradual reduction in the proportion of papers discussing legal and policy responses. So a decrease in the proportion in general, and a marked decrease in papers looking at counter-messaging specifically. The proportion of papers that are theoretical or methodological in approach has also remained consistently low. So for this reason, it's particularly pleasing to see the strong focus in this symposium on policy and practitioner responses. Similarly, returning to Maura's final suggestion, it's good to see the strong focus on gender issues in the symposium schedule, not least, of course, in the keynote presentation, which we are all looking forward to in a moment. So hopefully those slides, in one sense, answer the question, what is TASM? That gives you an overview of what we have covered in the past 4 TASM conferences. But there's another way of answering the question, which is to talk about the underlying ethos. So TASM is international. In 2024, we welcomed delegates from 25 countries worldwide, from Australia and Southeast Asia, Africa and the Middle East, to North and South America. It is collaborative. Over half of the papers presented in 2024 were co-authored, with more than half of those co-authored by colleagues at different institutions. It's multidisciplinary. The speakers at the 2024 conference came from 13 different academic disciplines. The majority were from politics, international relations, and criminology, but there were also speakers from communication studies, history, anthropology, law, psychology, computer science, data science, linguistics, management, and others. It's multi-stakeholder. While the majority of papers are presented by academics, there are also papers from those working in other sectors, including civil society organizations, law enforcement, government agencies, and the private sector. In 2024, we also had workshops delivered by TikTok, by GIFCT, Tech Against Terrorism, Meta's Oversight Board, and the UK's online harms regulator, Ofcom. It's a space for early career researchers. We really try to emphasize the importance of collegiality to provide a constructive environment for all speakers, and in particular, early career researchers. So in 2024, 29 PhD students had the opportunity to present their research. And for many, it was their first conference presentation. And this, I would say, is mutually beneficial because our experience has been that PhD students are often completing the most innovative and the most cutting-edge projects, looking at under-researched platforms and technologies. And finally, it is growing. 2024 was the largest TASM conference to date. Over the 2 days, there were 70 papers and 14 workshops with more than 250 delegates. And it's going to grow again in 2026 as we expand the event to 3 days. We've already accepted more than 80 papers, and there will be a number of side events both before and after the conference, including training workshops, the TASM Sandpit, a Voxpol summer school, and a symposium organised by the Voxpol Next Generation Network. Which brings me on to Voxpol. Everything that I've just said, international, collaborative, multidisciplinary, encouraging early career researchers, is also true of the Voxpol network and, of course, of AVERT as well. Voxpol was established in 2014 and for its first 6 years was funded by the European Union. In 2022, it was relaunched as a global network and now has over 100 different members from 21 different countries. As a network, we work together on a range of different activities. So we have Voxpol reports, which are peer-reviewed publications and are freely available from our website. On the screen, you can see the 4 reports that we've published this year. And I'd highlight in particular the one on gore and violent extremism, which Ali Fisher will be presenting at one of the sessions tomorrow. We have a weekly blog, and on the screen you can see the last 3 weeks' blog posts. We have an online library, which, as you can see, has over 2,300 different items, all relating to online violent extremism, and the library is fully searchable. We host webinars. Our next one is actually next week. You can see the details on the screen. Admittedly, it's at 4 a.m. Melbourne time, but we will be recording it and we will be making the recording available afterwards. And on our YouTube page, we have a lecture series. These lectures are aimed at undergraduate and master's level students and are intended to be a resource for colleagues to use in their teaching. Voxpol has also worked with Routledge to produce the forthcoming Routledge Handbook of Online Violent Extremism. This will be published in the middle of next year and will consist of 40 chapters written mostly by Voxpol members, providing a comprehensive overview of different forms of violent extremism online, the exploitation of different types of platform, and responses, as well as methodological and ethical issues. And then finally, we also have the Next Generation Network, which organizes dedicated events for early career researchers, and the Voxpol Institute, which is our commercial wing, seeking to generate revenue to help support the activities of the network by offering a range of different services, including commissioned research, training workshops, and written and verbal OSINT briefings. And there's a flyer in your delegate packs where you can find out more about the Voxpol Institute. So for more on all of the things I've talked about, there are some website addresses on the screen. There's also QR codes in the delegate packs. And I'll be around for all 3 days, and I'd love to have the opportunity to tell you more about Voxpol and TASM. But for now, thank you very much for the opportunity to make these remarks, and I look forward to 3 fruitful days of discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Stuart, for that excellent introduction and overview of both Voxpol and also the TASM conferences. As Stuart said, he'll be here for the next 3 days. And I'm looking forward to seeing many of you at the Voxpol organised and supported workshop tomorrow on gore and intervention, hosted by Dr. Ali Fisher. Now, without further ado, we're going to move into our keynote presentation this morning with our keynote speaker. As with all of our presenters, I'm not going to read out the full bio of Professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She certainly, I think, has a reputation that precedes her. If you'd like to read all about her, do have a look in your Avert Symposium notes. But enough to be said here. I think that Professor Cynthia Miller-Idriss is in the School of Public Affairs, in the School of Education at the American University in Washington, D.C., where she is also the founding director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab. After the keynote presentation this morning, we will have time for Q&A, so please do think of some questions to raise at the end. But without further ado, welcome, Cynthia. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. All right, hopefully that's working. I'm going to walk around. Hopefully that will not make too much trouble for the video. If it does, I can stay put. So somebody just put me in line if I'm supposed to stand. All right. Okay, so click here and make sure. Hang on 1 second. Yeah, okay, good. All right, thank you very much. Let me start by saying thank you to Michelle, to Julian, to Avert, to Voxpol and TASM for anything you did to also get me here as well and to host this incredible meeting, to ESAL for the unbelievable logistical support, and to so many of you who are here, crushed in this room to hear this, this keynote. I'm really delighted to be here. For those of you who don't know me, maybe I'll just say my background, some things that aren't in my bio, which is I started my career for 15 years. I was originally a comparative education professor. I thought I had zero relevance to anything in the field of national security. I was studying German school-based responses to resurgent hate and far-right extremism by coincidence, because I was studying the German vocational school system and happened to land in a school which had a very heavy neo-Nazi population. And so I wrote a couple of books on that German context. And then the second of those books was called The Extreme Gone Mainstream. And it was about youth aesthetics and how they had changed over time, the death of the skinhead scene, if you will, the emergence of a much more professionalized aesthetic, commercialized look. And then Charlottesville happened in the US, and I started to get asked to explain youth culture, far-right youth culture, testify before Congress, those kinds of things. And I got annoyed by the questions I was being asked by American policymakers and journalists, because they were sort of asking all about ISIS, but applied to the far right. Like, what's the chain of command of these groups, and how do they, how do the cells work? And, so I was like, well, maybe we should talk about memes and, try to explain some of online youth culture. And so I wrote Hate in the Homeland because I was annoyed by the questions that were being asked and the fact that I thought they were the wrong questions. I wrote this book, Man Up, because nobody was asking me any questions about gender or misogyny. I mean, even at the end of every journalist interview, they'll say something like, is there anything I've missed? And I'd say, well, we could talk about the fact that the kidnapping plot involved a lot of misogynistic words, right? Or the fact that there was a history of domestic intimate partner violence in this perpetrator. And it just never came out in the stories. It never came out in the questions. It was always an add-on. So I was annoyed. And I felt annoyed that I had to write it, even though there are a lot of people who've been saying this for a long time, including scholars who are going to present their work in this room or in another room nearby, and that domestic and intimate partner violence experts, a lot of Black feminists have been saying this for a long time, that there's a connection between interpersonal violence and national security issues that has been invisible or unregarded for a really long time. And so what I came to see eventually is that misogyny is really a constant. And I should say I define misogyny not in its colloquial usage as the hatred of women, but as a law enforcement function of the patriarchy. That is the way that the philosopher Kate Mann describes it. It means it's a way of policing gendered norms and expectations. It's important to define it that way because it means that women can enact it as well as men. It means that boys and men are often the subjects of it in terms of homophobic bullying that they experience as children, as teenagers, that the policing of gendered norms and expectations, including through violence, but also through online forms like belittling or harassment, are important mechanisms to understand in terms of how patriarchies are enforced. And that is a constant, although invisible, component to virtually every mass violent attack I looked at, I couldn't find one that didn't have it. Let's just say it that way. Doesn't mean that there aren't, but they almost all are. And in the US, this has sort of tipped the scale for me. The Biden administration released a new classification system for domestic violent extremism, which of course now is gone. But it was an attempt for them to get away from far left and far right as categories. And so they created this classification system that put kind of identity-based extremisms in one category that included things like environmental extremism or issue-based extremisms. They put animal rights extremism, white supremacist extremism, abortion-related extremisms kind of in one category. And then in the middle were all the anti-government extremisms, which included both sovereign citizens and unlawful militias, but also sort of anarchist and anti-fascist extremists as well. So they tried to create these classifications. That meant they had this huge category left over called all other domestic terrorism threats. And that includes all extremisms related to gender or sexuality, right? Or religion, by the way. So 3 of the fastest growing areas of harm in the domestic extremism landscape in the US fell into this category of all other. That I found incredibly irritating because what we know in the US at least, and this data is, I'd love to know in our conversation how consistent it is with Australia, but in the US, 60% of mass shooters have a history of documented domestic and intimate partner violence. That's in a context where over half of domestic violence goes unreported to begin with. And it doesn't include things like harassment, cyberstalking, revenge porn, sexual assault, rape, anything like that. This is just domestic and intimate partner violence, again, in a documented way as a criminal part of their history. We have rising domestic violent extremism in the US, including among incels, which will be talked about a lot today. If you don't know that term, it's involuntary celibates. the misogynist and violent form of which are in targeted attacks against women and against men who are deemed to take all the women, called Chads. We've had 50 plus deaths in the US just in the last few years at the hands of incels in documented ways. Again, not counting things like the Parkland school shooter in Florida, who praised the incel shooter who had attacked a sorority in California before he went in to do that school shooting, but it was not targeting women directly and no manifesto left behind that could identify him as an incel. So for example, that I would count as related, but is not exactly the same. We also have things like women's engagement increasing. We have this erasure on LGBTQ issues in the States that I'll talk about, anti-trans violence, and a documented crisis in men and boys' well-being that creates all kinds of vulnerabilities, which I will talk about. So in the end, the argument I make is that gender and misogyny are foundational to extremism and its violent outcomes in ways that we have to finally sit down and talk about. I'll give you just a few examples. I won't go through all of these, but basically every single case we could look at in the US, including a lot of cases that are never identified as related to gender. The Uvalde, Texas elementary school shooting, for example, where an elementary school was the target, but right before that, he had been making rape and kidnapping threats against teenage girls online. So when you look into the histories of essentially every single mass attacker in the US, they all have some sort of history. The Charleston, South Carolina killing of 9 African-American worshipers, for example, while he was enacting that shooting, he said, and excuse me for saying something so offensive, but this is a quote, he said, "I'm doing this because y'all are raping our women," right? So a gendered component to the motivation that has to do in this case with sort of false crime statistics and the protection of white women. Or for example, in Minnesota with the assassination of a congresswoman and her husband and the attempted assassination of 2 others, which the US media, and I don't know how the international media covered it, but the US media described it as attacks on progressive politicians. But the issues they were progressive on were all gendered. It was about abortion and LGBTQ rights. Nobody, not a single journalist ever mentioned that. It was all progressive, right? And so it's this complete invisibility and erasure of the motivations, even when they're gendered. All right, so I won't go through all of these, but basically every single case I looked at in the US has some sort of gendered component, either direct misogyny histories. This is of course true in virtually every other attack you can look at across the country, across the world, even when they're not documented, even when they're not reported as related to gender. The Hanau attacks in Germany, for example, he had a documented criminal history of extreme violence against a paid escort who had reported that to the police. It was never investigated and was dismissed, and then his violence later escalated into a mass attack that killed a lot of people. So across all of these terrorist cases, we can talk about them, there is some sort of history of misogynistic beliefs, anti-feminist claims, obsession with white birth rates and the control of women's reproductive capacity, domestic and intimate partner violence histories, anti-LGBTQ violence, or other kinds of sexual assault, harassment, and others. When you look at the incel forums, the users who are registered on the incel forums, on only the English language ones outside the US, it's also dozens of countries. So these are global connections around violence against women, around gender-based extremisms. And yeah, last thing I wanted to say there is that we actually do quite a good job of doing this. We know this exists and is a problem when it comes to violent extremism and terrorism. We just only use Islamist forms of terrorism as the example. So there are all, sort of a dozen reports from the UN and the International Criminal Courts on the exploitation of women and girls as part of the ideology, the operational tactics, the financial motivations of Islamist groups, including big campaigns around the Nigerian schoolgirls or the Yazidi women, broad public attention to it around the sexual violence of Hamas, of how al-Shabaab uses forced marriage as a tactic of territorial control. So it's one thing when it's Black and brown terrorists over there, right? There it gets identified. It does not get identified when, as I discovered, white supremacist extremists in the US are running prostitution rings. And it gets described by journalists as something like a little line saying the hostage negotiation team was on hand to assist, when that's a quote from the AP, when the Associated Press, when a neo-Nazi group was broken up with 63 arrests in California, charged with drug trafficking, racketeering, and weapons trafficking charges. But as we know from the Drug Enforcement Administration in the US, where there is drug trafficking, there is sex trafficking. It's like a 97% overlap. And so if the hostage negotiation team was on hand to assist, chances are the hostages were being used for trafficking of some kind. So we don't really expose it. There are a couple of other cases in Austria and in Spain where neo-Nazi groups have been arrested for running prostitution rings, but it's really like thin data. So one of the first things we need is more data on the scope of that problem. So I'll say that in the book, I approach it by looking at 5 ways that gender mobilizes extremism. The first is, I'm going to talk mostly about, is the most ordinary and everyday strategy called containment. The second is punishment. The third is exploitation, as I just talked about. The fourth is erasure, and the fifth is enabling. So in containment, I talk about the most ordinary ways that everyday forms of gender-based harm and misogyny open up pathways for young men to find an answer in more violent forms of extremism, create vulnerabilities. Punishment is the organized male supremacist and violent incel scene that we already have a fair amount of research on in our fields. Exploitation is, as I talked about, the child exploitation, but also sex trafficking and its relationship to extremist groups. Erasure is mostly legislative, but also parent-mobilized curricular erasure, book bans, curricular bans on LGBTQ issues, and its exploitation by groups like the Proud Boys. And then the white baby challenge, the enabling is the role of white women. So let me just talk a little bit about containment. And before I get into the strategies or the pathways that can happen, I just want to talk a little bit about how I got to see containment as a strategy. So I opened that chapter with an analysis of my own hate mail, which happened when I started to notice a pattern in the hate mail that comes almost all from men. I do sometimes get hate mail, interestingly, mostly from feminists who don't think I say enough. And so it's sort of interesting. But from the left, the arguments are usually from women who are mad that I haven't mentioned it or I missed it in a media interview. But the vast majority of hate mail, though, comes from men who sign their names as men, emails or leave voicemails with the voice of a man. And I started to notice this pattern that it was all kinetic. It all involved motion. They wanted me to go somewhere, right? So they wanted me to stop being front and center or go back under a rock or go back in the shithole or get back to Russia. Or one very polite man just said, I'm asking you to get out, but didn't say where I should go to or when. I think my all-time favorite, and the one that made me realize this was, I often get misidentified as either Jewish or trans. I think almost because some of these guys can't imagine that I could just be a straight, heterosexual, married woman who is also, who is nonetheless betraying my race and gender, apparently, by doing this. But so, for example, this guy called and left a voicemail after I appeared on CNN talking about the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband. And he said, very angry, like, why is it that you transsexual people are always front and center on the news? And he had this long anti-trans rant, and he hung up. And about 10 minutes later, he called back to correct his first hate message with a second hate message, right? That said, looks like I might have been wrong, right? And then it got very sexualized, right? About what body parts I do have. But both messages were about his anger that I was front and center. And that's where I started to realize this pattern. And I went back and looked through the other hate mail, which always gets reported, so there's a good file of it, to see that actually this pattern is really strong. And so I started to see this as containment, as a sort of common strategy of containment. So I will talk about the pathways that lead from containment to violent extremism in my research, but I first want to say something about what I think is so important. And the first thing I did when I turned in the book was reach out to both feminist activist communities and the men's wellness communities to seed the ground for the reception of the book and make sure that I was not stepping on any toes. And the men's wellness world in particular has received it really well. Those of you who are in Sydney, I'll be on Friday night at Glee Books with Zach Seidler from November in conversation about the book. And the feminist activists have too, but the men's wellness world have an expansive group of podcasts and work in healthy masculinities that have been really helpful. And they have really embraced the book and helped situate it within this context of vulnerabilities for boys and young men right now. That first of all acknowledge that boys and men are not just the victims of, or not just the perpetrators of the kinds of violence I'm talking about, but also the victims at the hands of other boys and men, often in ways that they talk about having survived their adolescence by kind of carving off pieces of themselves in order to fit into these models of bullying, where the gender policing was through bullying, but also violence or the perceived threat of violence from other boys. We know that there is, both among girls and boys, a loneliness epidemic, that in the US, young men have 3/4 of the deaths of despair now, which is suicides, overdoses, and alcohol-fueled deaths. Gen Z men have a higher rate of suicide than older generations of men for the first time ever. They have declining labor market outcomes. Now, my own university has 60-something% women, right? So a feminization of higher education happening, a rejection of higher education among boys. And all of this kind of creates some vulnerabilities to, of course, influencers online who offer pathways for this, but also open up their videos by saying things like, men are suffering and I'm the only one who will talk about it, right? So Andrew Tate, as you may know, has a 1/3 approval rate among Australian teenage boys. It's 20% in the UK and the US. And his right-hand man is now Sterling Cooper recruiting teenage boys for the neo-Nazi group National Socialist Movement here. So there's no logical explanation why a crisis of masculinity should have become a crisis of misogyny, but that is what happened. And it is only understandable if you understand how online worlds work and what kinds of solutions have been offered to boys and young men. And so that's what I talk about as the new misogyny, is the world of online engagement that has led to sort of outcomes like this, which is that Gen Z men are now much less likely than older generations of men to say they support women's rights or are feminist. Girls, by the way, Gen Z young women, are the most likely of any generation of women. So we actually have a bigger cleavage or divide on the polarized nature of that question than any other generation does. They also have as this is a large gender divide on these issues. And so compared to older men, younger men are much less likely to believe both in women's rights, but also are more likely to believe things like feminism has gone too far, right? That's a very common, I think 57% of American Gen Z men now believe that. So when I talk about these three pathways, there are three ways I talk about it. Online gaming, and I know we're going to hear a lot about that today, and including on a panel that I'm on around the Catalyst Project and the Christchurch Call Foundation, so I'm not going to talk more about that one right now. The second is memes and short form videos, which I'll happy to talk about in Q&A as well, and how easily it is to kind of frame all of this as just a joke. And then the third, what I do want to talk a little bit more about is self-help forums and influencers like Andrew Tate, but there are thousands of guys like him. So the self-help forums are, often what we find this pathway starts with a search for a 13 or 14-year-old boy on kind of something like about dating, about fitness, or about wealth, basically. Like, how do I get success in one of these three areas? And they can land on good influencers who offer them really helpful advice. They can also land on bad influencers who offer them helpful advice. And that is an important point, I think, that often they get advice from influencers who are still offering them meaningful guidance, like get 8 hours of sleep, make your bed, get a job, right? Go to the gym. They start to get, serotonin and endorphins start to feel better. And at the same time, they're getting this kind of scapegoating language around feminists being to blame for this, or what you really need is to take a strong hand and control women. It's okay to beat a woman, or it's okay to exploit a woman for profit, right? These kinds of ideas. And then also carrying often anti-Semitic and racist ideas as well. So in the Q&A, I'll talk a little bit more, I hope, about that pathway. I was telling Julian and Michelle that often the first question when I give this talk is from a parent or from a sibling of a young man, an uncle, of a young man, and so I'm happy to talk about that too, and talk about the tools that we use to advise communities on those strategies. But just to make sure that I get through a couple of other points before we move to Q&A, I'll review briefly what I have to say in the other chapter. So punishment is the chapter that I think that will be most familiar to the people in this room. It's a chapter that is tracing the male supremacist spectrum. I argue that it is a phenomenon driven by an obsessive focus on issues of purity, but also power and control and a desire for more worth and admiration. So we have a lot of groups there that you're familiar with: the men's rights movement, men going their own way, the pickup artists, which evolved into violent incel communities. They use a lot of language around women having sexual market value, how to overcome things like last-minute resistance in order to make sure you can get sex from a woman, and sort of dating academy tactics, right, is part of this sort of strategy. They're sort of sex and romance coaches, bedroom coaches online, who teach these sorts of tactics to control and dominate, and to make sure that you can be part of what they believe are a small percentage of men who are ultimately successful with the majority of women. Punishment is a chapter that really talks about the evolution of some of these groups into violent extremist movements and violent extremist subcultures online, communities that egg each other on, and how often we see the influence of those on forms of violent extremism, even when that's not identified. Like I talked about in the Parkland shooter, when we have a mass attack that never has an ideological motive, but nonetheless, that shooter has praised or admired in some capacity online a prior incel shooter, or has played the incel anthem while they live stream their attack, like a song that is popular among incels, for example. So there's often references to incel communities that I think show that the data set is much bigger in terms of its influence than the actual attacks that get identified as incel motivated. Those of you who watched Netflix Adolescence this summer will be more familiar with the incel community than most as well. Here, we also get into a lot of the anti-feminist conspiracy theories. Conspiracies that say that women are conspiring, feminists in particular, conspiring to take men's rights away. There's a big anti-rights discourse in these spaces that advocate for one household, one vote, for removing women's rights to vote, for removing reproductive rights, for advocating even, and sorry, so I should have given you a trigger warning, some of the things that happen in these chapters, for mass rape of white women in order to counter demographic change. There is, and I also acknowledge here in parts of this, here, but also elsewhere in the book, there's a normalization of some of these kinds of things in a lot of mainstream discourse. We just heard, I just read this morning, the Canadian Prime Minister publicly saying, we're done with feminist foreign policy. Our Secretary of Defense has called for male standards in the military. Mark Zuckerberg called for masculine energy in the corporate sector. We just had at the Charlie Kirk Memorial Service a comment from Steve Bannon that it was a wonderful display of muscular patriotism, or Christian muscular patriotism, right? So this resurgence of a normalization around that kind of superiority and inferiority is important to understand here too. And so the original title of the book was Just Grab the Bitch, which is a quote from the Michigan governor's kidnapping case. It got dinged by marketing, as you can imagine. I fought hard for it, but it didn't happen. And so, but I use that as an example of the kind of language that is constantly peppered throughout violent extremists' attacks and dismissed in the case of that trial as, quote, just big talk and blowing off steam. That's what the defense attorney said. Exploitation, this chapter really looks at both QAnon in terms of the far right's obsession, but also others who not in the far right who entered QAnon and became obsessed with QAnon on protecting children from sexual trafficking at the same time as, and the quote from the Vice, a Vice piece sort of sums this up, a journalist whose title of the piece said, "Why are so many neo-Nazis getting arrested for child sexual abuse material?" Right? It's a constant data point in the arrests, often because during the course of the investigation of a plot, that's the fastest way and the quickest way to get a long prison sentence. It just means it's showing up on their computers while those devices are being investigated. And there's lots of reasons why I think that happens, one of which is the pattern of exploitation. In this chapter, I also talk about the nihilistic violent extremist networks that we have some sessions on here over the next couple of days, including 764, which I think are among the worst of the worst trends we're seeing in the violent extremist spectrum, which is deliberate child exploitation and harm in order to either profit, exploit, or groom kids for later violent actions, including now 2 school shootings in the US, the Lady Gaga bomb plot that was interrupted, and some other attacks that were all tied to those, and we'll hear about those later. I also talk here about the sex trafficking issue and the way that we are much more likely to talk about that issue of the sexual exploitation and sexual-based violence against women when it comes to Islamist terrorists, but we don't really look at it or are unwilling to see it when it comes to domestic terrorists, at least in the US. I would love to know. I hope that that's different here. Finally, the last 2 chapters, I talk about erasure, which is, again, quite a US-focused chapter, but I think has real warning signs for everyone else on what's happening in terms of both the erasure of LGBTQ rights and women's rights through legislation, but also the way in which those get mobilized and acted upon by violent extremists. So we've had some murders, a murder of a shopkeeper who herself wasn't a member of the LGBTQ community, but happened to have a pride flag hanging outside her store, for example. We've had repeated burnings of pride flags outside of private residences, Proud Boys showing up at a neo-Nazi group showing up to protest Disney, for example, outside of Disney, because they felt that Disney wasn't doing enough to, I mean, there's some legislative issues going on that Disney was protesting in Florida, and so saying that Disney were supporting pedophiles. So neo-Nazis mobilizing in an opportunistic way, and Proud Boys groups mobilizing in an opportunistic way around these issues, drag story efforts, and more. And then finally, this chapter on erasure and enabling, where I use the both the trope of motherhood and the way that motherhood gets weaponized. We had in the 90s the accidental killing by federal authorities of Vicki Weaver, who was a white supremacist, a wife of a white supremacist herself, murdered in the standoff at Ruby Ridge. Some of you may be familiar with that. After several days, her son was killed, and she was shot accidentally through a door and died while holding a baby, became an immediate martyr for the white supremacist movement, who have still hold up signs sort of saying things like, your family could be next, right? And the family did win a court case, a lawsuit with substantial financial damages against the federal government, who was found to be in the wrong for that killing. But I compare that with the later killing of Ashley Babbitt, who was also shot through a door by federal law enforcement, but this time in the US Capitol while she was trying to break that door down on January 6th. And so it's the sort of the story of what happens over 30 years of how women are seen. And she was also martyred immediately by the movement and put up in memes and flags and T-shirts and all kinds of things. So she's a veteran, military veteran, combat veteran, and also not a mother. Vicki Weaver was kind of lauded for her role as a mother. They both became martyrs. And I think that 30 years tells a lot of the story of women's role in the movement. I also talk a lot about social media influencers in this chapter and the way that younger women are taking leadership roles in promoting, in particular, white supremacist ideas. So, for example, the White Baby Challenge that was issued by a young influencer online for white women to have as many white babies as she had had, which is 6, in order to counter demographic change. But looking at kind of the role of young women creating relatable content online that kind of can draw and has shown to draw not just young women, but also men. I mean, so we look at tradwife content, which is adjacent to these spaces, but can be used as a recruitment. And Evian Leidig has shown, as some of you may know, that up to 80% of some of those counts followers are actually men. So the content is fueling a fantasy for men, for some men, not just recruiting and showing a certain kind of lifestyle to women. Okay, so I want to wrap up by saying a few things about what we can do and what I think we may be, what we're seeing as success strategies already. So the first thing is I think there's phenomenal work, including Movember, which is founded here in Australia, and I think is really one of the global leaders in these issues around healthy masculinities, looking at men's well-being and looking at these outcomes as part of a broader crisis in men's well-being of mental health and physical health and outcomes. Like basically, as I often say, like the patriarchy hasn't worked out that well for men either. They die earlier, they're less likely to ask for help, they don't go to the doctor, right? There's a whole bunch of things that the man box culture has kind of created. And so the Movember movement and other men's wellness are trying to create better pathways that prevent men from young men from going down these violent extremist or mass shooting radicalization pathways, but also lead to better outcomes across the board in terms of interpersonal violence, in terms of their own well-being and life outcomes. So we have a program in the lab. You'll see a QR code on your table that takes you to the website of all the tools that we create in the lab, including in a program on men and boys. They're all free. We get them funded and we create them and test them and distribute them. So we have a guide that we create with the Southern Poverty Law Center called Not Just a Joke, Understanding and Preventing Gender and Sexuality-Based Bigotry. And among other things in that guide for parents, for teachers, for mental health counselors and others, we have some conversation starters and recommendations for how to have these conversations. We study parents longitudinally who engage with our tools. And one of the things we've learned is that parents, and community caregivers as well, but the parent data is the one that's in my head. They, within 3 months of engaging with our guide to online radicalization, for example, 6% of them, so about 75 parents in our 1,500 person sample, directly intervene with a young person who they now understood was exposed to harmful content or radicalizing content online. We know that the most common place they do that is in the car, which is why I have this image here. It's a good place to not have to make eye contact and to have those conversations with teenagers. We also know that parents' willingness to engage with a young person in their life who is exposed to harmful content online, including gendered or sexual-based bigotry, is dependent on their confidence, their willingness to engage is dependent on their confidence that they can do so effectively, and their confidence to engage is dependent on how much they know. So what we've learned is if we can increase their knowledge, that makes them more confident, and then that confidence leads them to be willing to do it. We know that they start to forget what they learn after 6 months, but they stay willing and confident for 3 more. So parents are really willing to do it. They just forget how to do it effectively. So we've gone back to our funder and said, what if we introduced a booster, like a short video after 6 months? So we have lots of data on that kind of thing as well. I conclude the book by talking about what's happened since. I mean, I turned the book in September, and then the election happened. And one of the things we immediately saw was Nick Fuentes, creating a short video that expressed tremendous glee at the success of the election over, quote, the bitches and baby makers who were put back in their place. And so the call, he sort of issued this video that said, "It's your body, my choice." And I was in the media talking about that video, which went viral, and immediately started hearing from parents about the kinds of things their young girls and women had experienced in the US. And so I just want to share a couple of examples so that you know what the culture has turned into in many ways. So a middle school girl right near me in Maryland was told to go put on her handmaid's dress the week after in the hallway of school. A 10-year-old in a playground was told by another boy, "Your body, my choice." It's not even clear if he understands what he's saying, right? But he heard it. An 18-year-old, someone who works in the same space as us, the daughter of a colleague who's 18 at the University of Virginia, had her butt grabbed at a coffee shop. And when she turned around to look at the guy, he said, "We can do that now," right? So this sort of like and that's, I mean, those are just three of the examples, right? The expansive kind of entitlement that immediately happened in the US that was palpable and that a lot of young women in particular felt. And so my editor encouraged me to include this anecdote that I end the book with, which is, I call it my "Oh, sorry, ma'am" era, about how I was jogging in my neighborhood a couple of years ago during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, and I got catcalled from behind. And when I looked at the guy over my shoulder, he stopped, he put his hands up like this and stepped back and said, "Oh, sorry, ma'am," right? So which meant to me that he was not apologizing for catcalling, right? He was apologizing for catcalling someone who he now understood might be old enough to be his mother, right? And so I talk about that because there's a kind of moment of invisibility that happens for middle-aged women where you stop being so objectified and you stop experiencing the catcalling as much. But the fact that he apologized for catcalling me, but probably wasn't apologizing for catcalling in general, wouldn't have apologized for catcalling my daughters, say, to me says there was a sort of special responsibility at this moment in my life to engage with these questions, because it's still happening to a kind of a younger generation, and those kinds of containment strategies in the everyday ways are pathways that we can intervene very upstream in ways that I think provably can have an impact on the outcomes that are violent later on. And so one of the things I'm really happy about the book is that a lot of these conversations that I'm having publicly, like in Sydney with Movember, or in Seattle in a couple of weeks with a woman who owns the first women's sports bar there that plays all women's sports. And it's a conversation about gender equity and misogyny in women's sports, where the women's basketball teams in the US are having sex toys thrown on the court while they play, right? I mean, the levels of misogyny happening for those athletes is kind of off the chart. And so there are ways to have this conversation. That's the kind of hopeful thing I would sort of leave you with, is I think that if it's happening everywhere, that means every one of us has a role to play and every one of us can engage. I think a lot of times looking at rising political or hate-fueled violence, we feel very hopeless. But I think that there are moments of hope in realizing there are ways to interrupt and off-ramp as a parent, as a teacher, as a coach. And so my takeaway here, along with the link to, which is also in the QR code, our tools, which again are all free and available, downloadable, based on research with Americans mostly, but we do have research now in Kenya, Jordan, and Canada as well, is that my takeaway here is that the prevention of mass violence, including violent extremism and terrorism, will only work if we understand these gender dimensions of violent extremism and how their kind of everyday and interpersonal forms also open up these trajectories, that they're foundational. I will stop there. We can have some question and answer, Julian. Thank you. Do you want to sit? Do you want to stand? What do you think?
We should stand.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Dan, I want to thank you very much for an excellent keynote presentation. We do have half an hour now for discussion, for questions and answers. I feel, Cynthia, like your book and your research has really brought together a whole series of strands into one place we've been seeing for quite some time in the violent extremist landscape. Your recognition of the underlying role misogyny plays, I think, in all forms of violent extremism is very timely. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions, perhaps also questions from practitioners and policymakers, not just parents, about what your research means for identification and interventions into violent extremism. So we have two roving mics around the room for those who'd like to ask a question. Please put your hands up. And I do ask that when you ask, do introduce yourself briefly, who you are and where you come from as well. So we have two over here.
Thank you. Thanks, Julian, and thank you, Cynthia. I'm Dr. Alex Spillin from Monash University. Lovely to meet you finally. Thanks for writing this book. Really a critical juncture we're at. Very excited to get my teeth into it. We have a project at the moment that is looking at supporting secondary school teachers against the effects of the manosphere in classrooms. It's the buy-on's been quite significant from schools as a problem. One thing we're finding amongst the young people that we're talking to in our focus groups is that there seems to be a general consensus that Andrew Tate is bad.
Yeah.
But he kind of has a point. And the thing we're getting back from the young people is that they understand that the counter to this messaging is actually the emphasis on positive and healthy masculinities, but it's not landing as well for them.
Yeah.
It's not as convincing.
Yeah.
So they're not being convinced by it. And consequently, they're still falling in that sort of, less extreme form of the influencer content. So I was wondering, in your experience and based on your research, if you have come across this or any sort of lessons learned for this particular dynamic.
Yeah, great. Alex, great to meet you in person. And I mean, there's so many. First of all, I should have said this. Australia is so far ahead of everyone else on this issue, and I hope some of you know that. There's so much more reporting. There's so much more government stakeholder accountability issues around the issue of misogyny. So much more interest in the media. So it's a particular pleasure to be here, including folks like Alex and Lydia and others who have really highlighted this for years, and Avert as well. I mean, you see it on the agenda today how much of a topic it is. Even the fact that I'm here giving the keynote, I think, is just a sign of how much these issues are being paid attention to. So kudos and thank you. I will say two things. One, what we're finding from teenagers and even younger. So I was saying yesterday that I had a high school 9th grader. We always ask kids themselves what they think adults should be doing. I think that's a really helpful question. And so they usually don't know, but they say the same thing, which is consistently. So the 9th grader said, whatever you do, don't make it sanctimonious, which I thought was like a great vocabulary word, like kudos to him. And then, 2 10-year-olds that we asked said, I don't know, but just don't make it preachy, right? Which is the exact same thing, right? So what they find is, there's a lot of finger wagging that happens. They're afraid they're going to lose their phones if they talk to adults about what they see online. So they don't really tell adults how bad it is. And so they're really eager for conversations about it that don't actually offer solutions right away. And so I think what they most need right now are spaces to talk about what they're seeing online and to process it and then let the solutions flow from that, right? So we're just really finding that when you ask them what they see online, they'll tell you terrible things, like horrific things. And then I say, have you told an adult? And they say no. And you're the first person we've told. One, they haven't sometimes even reflected on how bad it is. They're just scrolling past it. Like a lot of physical violence, abuse, child abuse, animal abuse, live stream murders, live suicides, the things that they say they've seen on a regular basis. And so that kind of normalization of violence in their lives without having anywhere to talk about it, I think is one of the biggest problems. And I think solutions should come from after that happens, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was absolutely brilliant talk.
Thank you.
My question is going to be a sort of researchy question, and it's about intimate partner violence. So you've drawn the connection, as a number of other people have, in terms of histories of intimate partner violence for those who commit attacks. I've been somewhat skeptical about this connection, partly because I've never heard anything convincing about the baseline figures. So my attitude would be, and certainly we've seen this in Australia, we've had through a number of public information campaigns about reporting domestic violence, transforming attitudes. It's been quite transformative here. So we've had successes in changing people's attitudes towards being upfront about DV in a way that we could learn from in the violent extremism space. Given that, the prevalence of intimate partner violence is much greater than perhaps we realized or recognized, because so much more is being reported. Are we seeing an overrepresentation of intimate partner violence in cases of people who have radicalized to violence, or is it just matching the baseline? And the reason that I become so concerned about this is because of my own caution about ascribing causation versus correlation, and also some of the risks around profiling and predictive approaches, which can then misfire if the data is not really rock solid. So love to hear your views on
Yeah, great question. I think, my cheeky answer would be, I don't think it matters, right? So in other words, if in our case, in the US, 60% of mass violent attackers from 1949 to 2019, at least, that's the purest data set, have a documented history. And I think that's actually updated now up to 2023, have a documented history of domestic violence at the criminal level. Is that an accurate reflection of the national population? I hope not. I hope it's not 60%. And even if it is, and that is some sort of part of a bigger story of the fact that virtually every single attacker in the US I could find had some sort of history. If it wasn't domestic and intimate partner violence, it was saying, I'm doing this because y'all are raping our women, or the obsession with white women's reproductive rates and demographic change, or the advocacy for mass rape of white women to counter demographic change, or something like that. This gendered foundation of the attack on the progressive politicians, right? As an example. So, in other words, it may be, and that would be good to know for research perspectives. But if it's such a prevalent part of the cultures or the pathways or the trajectories that precede mass violent attacks, it seems to me it's something to pay attention to. I wouldn't suggest that we see it as a red flag warning sign in terms of because that could reduce reporting. There's all kinds of things that could happen. But what you want are prevention tactics that look to reduce the interpersonal violence too, right? Because that should be reduced anyway, right? We would like there to be less domestic and intimate partner violence. I will say that one of my favorite things that happened in terms of understanding how badly people understand this connection in the general public was the book launch for this event in DC was with Rachel Louise Snyder, who's one of the US's leading experts on domestic and intimate partner violence. And she happens to be a professor also at my university and a New York Times columnist, and wrote this Oprah book, Oprah Book Club book called No Visible Bruises, a really great book. So she's a very prominent woman professor on my campus. I happened to see the provost a couple of weeks before this event at a big bookstore and said, oh, by the way, Rachel and I are doing this event. You should come, And she said, you and I, I'm also one of the more prominent women on campus. So there's two of us, we're known. The provost knows us both. She said, oh, I love you and Rachel are two of my favorite people. But what do you have in common? Right? This is our provost, right? Rachel works on the prevention of intimate partner violence. I work on the prevention of mass violence. She couldn't imagine why we would be in conversation with each other, right? So I told that to Rachel. My response was, I was proud of my gracious response, which was, you're my audience. You should come to the talk and find out. But that's really what I felt was, oh my gosh, this super smart woman, incredibly well qualified, who knows what I do, knows what Rachel does, has seen us both speak publicly, doesn't think we have anything to do with each other or any reason to be in conversation. That's a problem, right? Now, we do need data to parse out what exactly the causality is, and to make sure that we're not using things as a red flag that cause problems. Same thing with victims of sex trafficking. We also don't want to create reporting mechanisms or incentives for law enforcement that cause harm for victims. I mean, this has to be done thoughtfully, but we also just don't have the data because we don't look at it.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Derya Ayner from Chastert University and Islamic Science and Research Academy. I'm a researcher as well, looking at Islamophobia, but very much interested in digital media literacy and education. And in your presentation, I wonder if it's just misogyny, if it is one ring in the chain. If we can if we can take one step back, maybe it is about violence itself, we see, because games, killing, or immorality in general, because it is about admin abuse, like stealing, very, commonly used words, but they are very immoral. So is it about really violence because of that cowardice or pragmatism.
Mhm.
That's why they're just finding the easy victim.
Mhm.
Maybe they're also against or violent towards environment or other things, pets and other things as well. This thing is important, I guess, because then we can think about what kind of interventions.
Yeah.
Misogyny can be one, but what is the deeper cause? How
Yeah.
do you see it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I wouldn't say that misogyny is more important than any other factor. What I've described it as, and others have described this as like a sort of ideological glue that connects so many different forms of violent extremism that it's worth looking at and that it's sort of foundational both in its misogynistic expressions and also the sort of the broader gendered dimensions like false crime statistics about rape or protection of women, demographic change and reproductive rights. But I agree that, I mean, we're also seeing upsurges in the nihilism, the sort of the nihilistic violent extremism, which includes a lot of animal abuse and self-harm, for example, on video, that is, harm directed often at girls, but girls are targeted in some of those cases on message boards with, bad actors who say that they're their boyfriends, right, and get them to, be persuaded to engage in harmful things. So yeah, I think that's a good empirical question. Is like, I wouldn't say address misogyny and don't address these other things. Is it possible that there's something more foundational than misogyny that links it all? The propensity to violence, the willingness to be violent, the desire to be violent, certainly are kind of emotional impulses that I would say are also highly linked to masculinity, and to what the Germans call, the word is a fantastic word in German called gewaltbereit, which is the readiness to be violent, which is what a lot of boys say they feel they have to possess that capacity. It's a hallmark of being a man and of making sure that the way you walk around in the communities that they're in includes the kind of like on your chest, this readiness to be violent, that pressure. So, but that I would say you could also still tie back to masculinity. So, it's something that is worth disentangling. I wouldn't say ignore the other things, for sure.
Okay, so we have a question down from this side of the room, and then we're going to move on afterwards over to this half.
Hi, I'm Catherine Nolan. I'm from Deakin. I walked into the wrong room. I'm supposed to be in the Lawyers Protection Conference today.
Welcome.
And I'm so glad that I was too embarrassed to leave when I realised halfway through the opening remarks.
Awesome.
What I would like to ask about is, I was really interested in a comment you made towards the end about kids being really eager for conversation, but they want to have that conversation without being told what the solution is. And my background is design thinking, so that really interested me. And I'd be really interested in your comments on the about to begin social media prohibition for children. And what you think about that and its potential just generally.
Yeah, great question. I'm glad you stayed. You're welcome. I mean, we have the same debate going on around social media. I don't think we're ever going to get to a social media prohibition, but we have cell phone, a lot of discussions around what we call bell-to-bell bans of basically like how can you, I think of it as the same strategy as building better fences, basically. Like it's a secondary prevention tactic that says, we're not, we can't affect the content. We're just going to keep kids away from it as long as possible. We're going to keep, it's the equivalent of, I think, teaching synagogues how to lock their doors before service begins. That has saved lives. But also, I often say, I really don't want like our best measure of how successful we've been at prevention to be how good we've become at barricading the doors, right? Like that can't be enough. We have to be doing things that are more upstream, that reduce the production, that reduce the reception, that improve not just how much we can keep from kids, but what they do when they see it. Because inevitably they do see it. They find ways around those bans. They use VPNs, they use, fake accounts, they get their siblings to produce accounts. They do still find ways to see the content. And if we rely only on the barrier as a solution to it, it's not enough. So, I'll just tell you my favorite thing that happened this year was in a conversation with a bunch of 11th graders when afterward, I was in a high school talking about social media algorithms and the content that comes to them. And afterward, they often, as they often do, surround the podium and a young man started asking me about, in all the interviews I've done with men and boys in my career, which I have always interviewed young men and boys, what had I learned that I thought that people didn't know? And so we talked about that for a while. And so then I said, well, tell me, what do you think adults don't know about what it is to be a boy your age? And without missing a beat, he said, I don't think people understand what it's like to suddenly realize the world sees you as dangerous, right? And there's a girl right next to him, and she said, well, I don't think boys understand what it's like to suddenly realize that you're seen as a sexual object. And I said, maybe the two of you should be having this conversation, right? And the teachers are right there. And so then they said, it was remarkable, that can we start a club to have these conversations at school? This is last March. And I said, look, if you start a club, I'll come back. And so they started the club. And so now I'm going back again in March, this time with Mark Green, who runs the Good Men Project, to have a whole day of conversations with those kids that are now high school seniors, also to help understand what they think we could be doing for younger kids to facilitate those conversations. So that's what I mean by, like, I don't know the outcome yet or what we should be talking about, but I know that I learn as much from the questions they ask, and that hopefully a few years of doing that kind of thing will lead to some solutions of things that might work. But the first thing I know that they desperately want is a place to talk.
Hi, my name is Mohammed. I'm a researcher at Vic Uni. I was just thinking about your presentation, which is excellent. And I was just wondering if you know of any pieces of work or any researchers that have explicitly sort of approached this or framed it through a question of patriarchy.
Yeah.
Because to me, it's like patriarchy is, men having all the power in society.
Yeah.
And if you take a step back from terrorism and violent extremism, that's political violence, politics as power.
Yeah.
And it's, as you pointed out, it hurts boys and young men too.
Yeah.
And older men. I was just wondering.
Yeah, great question. I think, so Pasha Dashgard, who is our director of interventions in the lab, he is an expert on male supremacism, which is also a part of the patriarchy. It's not the patriarchy itself, but it's an outcome of it. And he runs our interventions in the men's and boys programming, along with one of our fellows who has been doing work with men and boys for decades. I would say the research that Pasha has produced is probably a good place to start. Also, the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism, which starts from the standpoint of looking at it as an ideology like white supremacism, would be a part of that. I really like Kate Mann's framing in Entitled and Down Girl, those books, which is really that's where the idea that misogyny is the law enforcement arm of the patriarchy. It basically says sexism is a set of attitudes. The patriarchy is held up by two things: sexism, which is a set of attitudes, and misogyny, which is a set of practices. And the practices are the law enforcement function, which keep people in their place, boys and girls, men and women, and everybody in between, who is told basically how to adhere to a certain rigid set of gendered norms and expectations. And it's just a really helpful framework for thinking about it and for allowing a more expansive way of thinking about gender policing, I think. So as foundational to some of what happens, and including ways that create anger among boys about the bullying that they experience in ways that have created vulnerabilities. So those are the ones that come immediately to mind, but I will give some thought to it. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions, particularly perhaps from practitioners and policymakers in the room. Down the back here.
Thank you. My name's Sean. I'm a senior policy and project advisor at Victoria Police Counterterrorism Command. Thanks for the presentation. I think it was really interesting and poses some really interesting questions in terms of policy and CVE intervention approaches. My question is very much in line with some of the preceding questions, particularly from Michelle Grossman. I was just wondering, in your research looking at mass shooter offenders, noting that you saw sort of a prevalence of gender-based violence offences as sort of the criminal antecedents, were there any other patterns that you noticed in terms of, or that you looked into in terms of other forms of criminal offending or other sort of patterns there with the offenders? And the reason I ask is because in Australia we have such a strong funding focus on CVE intervention programs. Yeah. We're getting so, we're trying to tackle a lot of the problems at its roots in terms of particularly young people when they're starting to show those vulnerabilities and prevalence to radicalization. But part of the issue is when we get to those early stages, a lot of the vulnerability factors are common to many forms of, I guess, criminal offending or criminal antecedents. So we constantly grapple with when is this a countering violent extremism problem? When is this a counterterrorism response problem? Or is this a domestic violence? Is this a social cohesion problem? Sorry, there's a lot of things to unpack there, but I'm just interested if that was the common thread or if there were other common threads in criminal offending that we can look into.
There is, I think here you have to distinguish, at least in the US case, between members of groups and individual attackers. So in the US, there's been no successful mass extremist attack all the way back to Oklahoma City 30 years ago at the hands of someone who was a formal member of a group, right? So the attacks are heavily represented on the, by people who are radicalized now online and those people tend not to have the same kind of criminal histories as members of groups. So the members of groups do often engage in other criminal activities. And then because of that, they're on the radar of law enforcement or they're successful, the strategies that our intelligence and FBI and law enforcement have used against possible mobilization of violent extremism, like infiltration, monitoring, surveillance, breaking up plots, have been successful. There's like 2.6 plots in the US broken up a day right now. So that's high, right? There's been a 2,000% increase since the 1990s in plots. So those tactics are working, but they don't work against the individuals who are radicalized by propaganda produced by some of those same groups, but consumed online and then mobilized individually in ways that don't leave it the same kinds of warning signs. They leave other kinds of warning signs, right? Not prior criminal activity, but these, and so gendered violence, gender-based violence, misogynistic actions are one type of warning sign that we miss. There are others as well, I would say, things that also look like other problems that kids and young people have, like isolation, withdrawal from other activities, quitting, right? So it could be drug abuse, could be this, right? But they could be being groomed for something else. They look very similar in a lot of these kinds of cases. So I would say that's where we were talking about the need for more psychologists, right? And the issue of neurodiversity, which I know you're working on. I think that you get into like a sort of different set of warning signs and red flags and therapeutic interventions that might have worked that are less, I would say, effective within the framework of these other very successful strategies that the police have been using, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Hello, my name is Dr. Jennifer Robinson. Thank you so much for your speech. I'm asking this question as a mother and also as a researcher. I also have a 15-year-old boy who I trap regularly in my car, so I've appreciated that one. I was just wondering if you looked into the role of mothers, actually, because in part of my PhD, I looked at the backgrounds of the extreme right in Australia and New Zealand for the last 22 years. And DV obviously came up quite extensively in the background, a lot of these people. But what really shocked me, actually, was the amount of times that the domestic violence was perpetrated by the mother or absent mothers. You always assume that DV is led by the father. There was an awful lot that were abused sexually, mentally, everything else by their mothers. And I'm just wondering if that is something that's been looked at. I didn't get a chance to develop that any further.
Yeah.
But it's something I would like to look at. It's something I'm wondering if you've looked at. You know, in fostering that misogyny, what's the relationship with their mothers?
Yeah, great question. I have not looked at that, and it's a good question. I don't know whether those of you who work on these issues are aware of any studies. I'm not aware of any studies that I can think of, so I think that would be a gap. I do know there's, what we do know about mothers, mostly from our research, comes from the other side of parents' engagement and prevention. And there's a couple of things there that are interesting, but not exactly what you're talking about. One is that mothers come into our studies knowing more already about the online harms that their kids experience. They spend more time with the intervention and they learn more. So they're a good partner, right? I mean, it doesn't mean that we abandon fathers, but they're committed in a lot of ways to the time that it takes to do this sort of engagement. The other thing I'll say about parents in general is that we learned that through our interventions with parents, every single group of parents demographically improves their ability to recognize online misinformation through our interventions in as little as 7 minutes, pre and post testing, except one group of parents, which is the most highly educated urban parents get worse. And so the interesting thing about that is because they come in so confident in the pretest that they can already do it. And then they get worse once they realize sort of how tricky it is. It's coded. There's these apps. There's these encrypted places, right? Or whatever, unmoderated forums. When we talk in just 7 minutes about what they should be aware of, they realize that they're overconfident. And then their confidence they can do it declines. And so one of the things we realized with parents is that it's not enough to look for improvements. Sometimes you also have to correct overconfidence because parents won't ask for help if they don't think they need it. And so the most highly, and I count myself among that group of overeducated urban parents, like me, basically don't think they need help and aren't likely to seek it. So that's as much as we know about parents on the prevention side, but I think it's a really good question to look specifically at mothers. There's been a lot of work on mothers on the prevention side and with Islamist groups in terms of mothers' networks afterward, but I haven't seen anybody doing any research on the abuse side as a precursor. So it's a good question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more very quick question and answer before morning tea.
Thanks, Julian. Thank you again, Cynthia, for a fantastic presentation. I was really struck when you were giving your presentation that you said when we were going through the jihadist phase that there was a lot of awareness and emphasis in terms of violence against women and the role that played. But at the same time, there was also a lot of, maybe excusing is not the right word, but I'll use it, that this is just the culture, that there is a patriarchal culture within Islam, within Arab countries, and a framing around that. I'm wondering, when you're taking a look at it in Western contexts or around white supremacy or in the United States with what's happening right now, the argument also will go back and say, well, this is also part of a culture. Or certainly the people who espouse some of these beliefs are saying, well, we're going back to a culture that we want or a traditional way. So what's your thinking around that, or how would you respond to it?
Yeah, I mean, two things I'll say. One, I try to make that point about Islamist movements because people will recognize that in those types of extremism, there have been these big campaigns, these global movements, and a lot of attention to it. But as people have often pointed out who work on the issue, that hasn't led to change, right? So it hasn't actually led to in the UN, for example, there haven't been successful strategies to mitigate that or to actually intervene or to create any kind of interventions around it. It's just more awareness. So I think we have to acknowledge that it's not like it's been solved in any way. It's just more publicly acknowledged. I think, yes, we certainly see in Western contexts the kind of boys will be boys, or this big talk and blowing off steam kind of dismissal. And the fact that the cultures of, just this week, you probably know, Trump told a reporter, quiet piggy, right? I wrote an op-ed about it, a woman reporter, just the kinds of things that are so normalized right now in mainstream discourse in the US, the male standards, the masculine energy, the quiet piggy, from leaders is, it doesn't help the situation, right, in any way. And so, yes, and you do bump up against a kind of, well, people have the right to have traditional gender relationships or traditional gendered beliefs, which is of course true. And so we bump up against this with the evangelical community, for example. what we tried to distinguish between, what I try to distinguish between is like personal beliefs and harmful mobilization to violence. And so that something that is creating a kind of hierarchy of superiority and inferiority that allows for a belief system to emerge that is about control, dominance, aggression as a mechanism of retainment of power, like we see, can open up pathways to violence that we want to avoid, right? And so that's as close as we can get. But you do have strong defense, including among women in the US for, we just had a conservative conference in September where a woman made a speech that went viral that said women had ruined the workplace. And the New York Times ran a op-ed on it called Have Women Ruin the Workplace, right? Which, so yeah, I think those are the, but this normalization part of it has to be taken up for sure. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Cynthia, for a fantastic and thought-provoking keynote and discussion. I think it's an excellent start to the 3-day symposium. Once again, thank you so much, Cynthia.